Okay, so now that we have looked at first looking at the American South and its road, the Prussian road to capitalism, and then looking at South Africa and its sort of the imperial state as the prime mover, we're now going to look at Japan, specifically looking at how it is a revolution up from above. So like the other two examples we've looked at today, Japan took a different route to capitalism than the classic case. Now, what happens in Japan in the mid-19th century is in many ways a revolution, but a different kind of revolution. It's not a democratic revolution, nor is it a kind of massive social revolution where people storm a government building, although it is a massive revolution, but it's the beginning of a fundamental transformation of Japanese society, culture, and economy, and in that way it is a revolution. Now, the Japanese case is very interesting, largely because it was a deliberate attempt from an elite ruling class, or at least a faction of an elite ruling class, to bring about industrial capitalism. Now, if you guys remember from a few weeks ago, but especially the week when we had to look at the liberal democratic revolutions, I was careful to emphasize that even though these revolutions did not began with feudalism and then eventually would lead to capitalism, it's not like one day there was feudalism, the revolution happened, and then the next day there was capitalism, right? Those revolutions in England and in France and the United States laid the groundwork for the flourishing of industrial capitalism. And nor were they deliberate attempts to bring about capitalism. They were mostly deliberate attempts to secure property rights that then laid the foundation for capitalism. So ironically, the revolution is not really called a revolution in Japan, but a restoration, the Meiji Restoration. Now, what's interesting in the case of Japan is that they actually were trying to deliberately bring about a capitalist, or moreover, really an industrial capitalist transformation. Now, the Meiji Restoration is named after the Emperor Meiji, who reigned from the 1860s until 1912. And as I said, the Japanese case is different in that it actually was a deliberate attempt to bring about industrial capitalism. And part of the reason why, and we'll get into this in much greater detail in a few minutes, is that Japan saw the march of Western colonialism rapidly increasing in Asia. And they saw industrialization and more broadly what they called modernization as the only way to avoid the fate that befell other nations. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but specifically they were looking at the Opium Wars, where Britain, at least in the first Opium War, routed the Chinese Navy. And this really scared a lot of the ruling elite of Japan, largely because, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, is the Japanese looked to China as it's the Middle Kingdom, right? Even though the Japanese were proud of who they were and saw themselves as a distinct group of people, China in, say, East Asia is very much the way that Europeans looked back to ancient Rome, right? It was the center of civilization. And if the center of civilization, if the Middle Kingdom could be defeated by these tiny little barbarians from, a kind of provincial backwater on the other side of Asia, then what could happen to them? Especially since, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit more, that the country had closed itself off from foreign commerce really from about, I think, 1634 up until the 1850s, when Commodore Matthew Perry of the U.S. Navy in 1854 sails into Tokyo Bay in an ironclad steamship complete with massive cannons and wants to open Japan up for commerce. And when he demonstrates the power of the American ironclads, the Japanese realize they have nothing that can actually match it and are forced to sign what become these unequal treaties, just like what happened to China, and take a kind of subordinate position. And this creates a lot of unease and outrage amongst the ruling elite in Japan, and they recognize that if they don't change and become an industrial power in the same way that Britain, the US, and France is, then they could very easily become colonized or sliced up in the way that was happening to China. Now, before I get into a lot of what happens, we're going to look at a video from Professor Andre Sorensen, who is a specialist in the history of East Asia, and he's just going to give a little bit more context into the revolution from above that takes place in Japan.